So let's touch on running technique and drills. So where does running drills fit in within your coaching and training? And do you do that in the warm ups or do you do it as a separate session? So where does working on technique fit in?
Yeah. So drills, technique drills, it can fit in a few places really. But if we think about the purpose of running drills first, it's threefold. Again, another thing that's threefold. There's obviously a technical element to it. We're trying to cue certain technical aspects, which will hopefully then translate across into improved running form in the complete action over time. That is certainly an element of it. But I think there's also a mobility element to it as well. So when we were talking about what a running coach does, and I mentioned different types of basic and build, another aspect is mobility, which I didn't really touch on. But I guess if you are accruing a high level of mileage, it's quite a repetitive, one dimensional kind of thing. And when you're running at a slower pace for longer distances, you're not really working through a very big range of motion. So if you're doing a lot of that over time and you're not doing a lot of other work, it can lead to the athlete getting less mobile and and tighter over time, which we don't need to be super flexible as runners, but we want to avoid getting tighter and tighter over time. So some mobility work in there can be useful, but also running drills can serve as a little bit of a mobility tool because essentially a running drill is an exaggerated form of running. You can do different drills, which exaggerates different aspects, but you are working through a greater range of motion and it can help to maintain that range of motion. So that's one of the benefits in my eyes. And then the third benefit on top of mobility and technique is some of the drills can be plyometric in nature. So we can get a bit of a plyometric stimulus and we actually start putting a lot of force into the ground with some of the drills. And so we can get a bit of a strength and conditioning stimulus from some of these drills. So some S&C coaches, you will see them putting some running drills within the main S&C session. I tend to not do that on the whole. I tend to be a little bit more traditional, maybe put them in the warm up. And this goes back to something mentioned a little bit earlier as well, sort of potentiation. So I mentioned maybe you can do some plyometric exercises, for example, the day before a session, like a key running session, because it might have a bit of potentiation whereby it helps, as long as you don't go overboard on the volume, it's quite low volume, it actually stimulates and improves performance the next day. Same kind of thing with the running drills, maybe on an even lower level, if it's incorporated into the warm up just before you start your main reps and you're selective with which drills you use, that the impact of them, the plyometric stimulus that's there can be a useful part of the warm up to potentiate performance going into the sessions. So yeah, I tend to put them in the warm up. Not too much volume, not too many different drills. To be honest, I'm very selective with what I use on the whole. I'd rather have one or two drills be performed really well and with a lot of intention than performing a whole host of different drills with perhaps less focus where I don't know, you're chatting to me, you're not really paying attention. I'd rather just pick one or two, really focus on them and perform them with intent. And one particular drill I like is called the A skip. So I'll just try and describe it as best as I can. Essentially a high knee drill, but with an added skip into each high knee, if you like. So there's an extra foot contact, and that extra foot contact just helps keep every foot contact a lot shorter. And short ground contact times or short periods in which you're working is what makes plyometric in nature. And so that A skip is really useful for keeping ground contact times short, keeping it more plyometric in nature and putting a lot of force into the ground. So that's one I like to use quite a lot of the time. Going back to what I would do differently if I was working with, say, a youth athlete, if I was working with a youth athlete or a group of youth athletes, I would probably use a much wider selection of drills and probably not even be too worried about them being super specific to running. I might do more lateral ones, karaoke's, whatever, mix it up quite a lot because with the youth athlete, I'm probably less concerned about a strong plyometric stimulus and more concerned about just the skill development aspect. And we know, I guess, from a motor learning perspective and skill development, if we've got a lot more variety in the session, that helps with skill retention. So in terms of how much that skill might improve in a single session, if we're just focusing on one thing during that session, then within that session, we'll probably get a bigger increase in skill development. But in terms of how well that skill is retained the next day or the next week or the next month, if there was more variety in there, then that tends to result in better skill retention. So yeah, with the youth athlete, I'd be looking at a whole range of different drills and trying to mix it up as much as I can. But then with the more established senior athletes, I'm a lot more selective.